or, you know, if we're talking light rail, it might be area to go over all of it. You know, those types of things. So those, we're dinging light rail because of that particular issue. It adds expense, it's gonna add clearance issues, and there's gonna be tricky design associated with it. So that's what this goal is trying to accomplish.
So Diane actually already covered this, but just very quickly before I get into the results of our detailed analysis for the North Corridor, I just wanted to quickly remind you we're looking at basically 4 alignments here, which are the ones you see on the map, but we have different modes that we're considering for these alignments. So really it's ultimately 9 alternatives in total that we're evaluating. So again, the light blue is our commuter rail. It uses the existing BNSF right-of-way. The darker blue follows Classen and then actually uses BNSF on up into Edmond, and the orange, gold, yellow, whatever color that is to you, that actually uses all arterials, so it does Classen and then gets on the Broadway extension. And then of course we have our eastern alignment, which is the red one, that uses all arterials as well, and uses the MLK Eastern Corridor. I guess just to cover this quickly, we do have, so that you know in terms of stations, we have 7 stations for the commuter rail, the N1 alternative. That's actually the fewest number of stations for these alternatives. For N2 and N3, we have 12 stations, and then N7 we have 11. N1, 2, and 3 all have dedicated right-of-way, so we're completely out of traffic here. We're not sharing any lanes with other vehicles. Whereas N7, we're actually looking at more of a mixed flow here. So we see how it interacts with other vehicles. So these are the results for the North Corridor. This is similar to what we showed you in the last round of analysis. So just to set it up, each bar here represents one of the alternatives. You'll see N1 on the left, N7 on the far right. You'll see for N2, obviously that's one alignment, but we have 3 modes here. So we're looking at BR, bus rapid transit, light rail, as well as streetcar. That's what SC stands for. As Brian mentioned, really you shouldn't focus too much here on the overall scores. The total points aren't as important right now because as we mentioned, we're going to be looking at other ways of scoring these, and so that ultimately could change slightly. But really what we want to focus on here is how they score within each goal. So for example, on N1, the commuter rail alternative, it scores well from a technical feasibility standpoint. That's the purple, the color that you see there. Obviously, that travels within existing BNSF right-of-way, so there's a lot less technical issues than there is if it were to travel on an arterial street. It also scores well in providing a balanced and coordinated multimodal system. So it does a good job of connecting other modes. It connects to highways well, it connects to pike and bike well, it connects to pedestrian facilities. The station areas have pretty good sidewalks around the stations. Where it does poorly is in enhancing regional connectivity. So it does not connect the activity centers as well as some of these other alternatives do. And it also, it doesn't do as well in supporting economic development and shaping growth. So what that means is, you know, a lot of the land uses around this alternative are industrial in nature, which makes sense because this is a freight rail market. Doesn't mean that there's obviously future opportunity there for redevelopment, but in terms of current development momentum, there's not a lot around this alternative, so that's why it scored poorly there.
Is it a function of the number of stations you have?
No, not necessarily the number of stations. It's really just the existing development of the stations.
Okay.
Exactly. N2 scored the best out of all of them. You can see it scored really well in terms of the providing a balanced and coordinated multimodal system. That's the green color. That's a function of the ridership. N2 actually had the highest ridership, one of our alternatives. It also does well in economic development and shaping growth. Again, this really hits areas, you know, along Classen and then up from there that there's some existing development going on. It's not surrounded by a variety of land uses. It's not as difficult to redevelop. It also scores well for enhancing regional connectivity. It really hits our population and employment centers as well as the activity centers because we kind of just go through the heart of those areas. In 3, it scored okay. It did really well in terms of economic development. Again, it really hits those areas where there's existing development going on, and it had very good ridership as well compared to the other alternatives. The It doesn't do as good of a job of the regional connectivity, so it doesn't hit the activity centers as well as N2 does. And the technical feasibility it's more difficult from an engineering and environmental and social impacts standpoint. And then finally, N7, it scored extremely well in enhancing regional connectivity. So if you think about that alternative, it goes out of downtown, it goes over and hits health sciences, Capitol Complex, Adventure District, downtown Edmond, downtown OKC. I mean, there's a lot of activity centers there for it to hit. So that's why it scored so well in that goal. Of course, the issue you have there is there's a lot of gaps between development. So you go through areas where there's really not much development going on at all. So that would be the reason why it did not score well for economic development or also for balanced and coordinated multimodal system. So I guess before we move on, are there any questions here? Does this make sense?
Most of you are probably looking at your color-coded sheet, so if you've got some questions about that. Like we talked about earlier, we're looking for some coaching on what's the best way to try to present all of this.
Let me ask, you're talking a lot about existing development and these rail lines. What about opportunities for TOD?
And then definitely.
Is that valued into here where there might be, you talk about where there's vacant land, that would seem to me to be an opportunity. It's hard to move an existing industrial facility, but it's not as hard to build something on an existing vacant lot.
Exactly.
Is that worked into any of these equations?
Yes, it is. That was actually part of the economic development analysis, would look at vacant parcels as well.
So what I call kind of the Christmas tree table that you guys have, mine's hard to read because I printed on 8.5 by 11. But if you go down to the second goal, support economic development and shape growth, and then the last criteria in that one is economic development potential, and then in parentheses, average per station. And really, that kind of shows you where the commuter rail, for example, comes up as more that, that green color, which green is go, right? So that's a good result, if you will. And that is because on a station basis, you can see that there is a potential for redevelopment in that corridor.
But you mentioned earlier, you said that because we just have a fairly binary rating system, 1, 0, 1, that it could make it look like the delta is bigger than it really is.
Correct.
By the same token, it might make it look smaller than it really is. If something,
Potentially.
I mean, you might have a 10 versus 1 rating. To that point, what about technical feasibility? Because to me, all this is great, except on the technical feasibility, if there are ones that get a -1, but in reality, they're a -10, because it's
Right.
just, how does that factor in, if at all, into this?
It's coming. I think the way the evaluation kind of played out, the commuter rail did not perform very well for lots of reasons. And we probably need to try to get into some of what those reasons are, obviously. But I think you hit the nail on the head. That's sort of the third leg of the stool. We've got financial capacity to think about. We've got, what you mentioned, technical feasibility, and if we're spending $150 million on commuter rail to get a third of the ridership versus $1 billion on light rail, to get a little bit higher, but certainly not 3 times higher or 5 times higher or whatever. That's definitely needs to play into this. So as we move forward in the process, I think that will weigh into it. So certainly with these results, we would not be interested in eliminating commuter rail from the analysis. And some of the things that the model showed that surprised us were that there's a lot of shorter trips. In the model, transit was competing better with automobile on shorter trips, which was a little bit surprising. So that would speak towards a BRT or to a streetcar or something like that on some of these corridors. The other issue, especially in the north, is that we're only talking about a 14-mile line. Commuter rail usually works for something a little longer than that, so that's working against it. We need to do some analysis on pairing it with the south side and making it, for all intents and purposes, a longer facility and see what that does. We have, in the results we've gotten so far, we don't feel like we've adequately addressed that, so we'll get to that.
And one of the things we're thinking about, to kind of get to your point about how the numbering and the ranking of it can really kind of exaggerate it, if you will, or not show the exaggeration you want to see. And so that's one of the things that we're looking at doing and bringing to you for your work session, is to kind of have it broken out into more, you know, I'd say this is a more simplified version, from the standpoint that when we were trying to look at a number of alignments in one corridor and quickly cull out the top 4 or whatever, like we did previously, to come up with the alternatives we were moving forward into the detailed evaluation, I think it was a really good method to use. I think on this method, it shows you one thing, but I think you also have to see the other, which is really saying, okay, there's 9 alternatives, we really need to rank them against 9 and kind of see all the gray pieces in between so that you can really start to see a story. Again, it's one of those things where as you get the data, you start asking different questions, and then that leads you to see different things. So we do have in here a little bit about what we're starting to see percolate up out of the analysis, if you will, which I think will help and generate some discussion as well with you guys. So I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, well, just to expand on that too, you know, having gone through each of these criteria, there are some that you could have a 10-point scale, you could probably even have a 20-point scale, and see some very big differences between them. Whereas there are some others that really doing the, you know, 1, 0, -1, even that's kind of a stretch. So it kind of depends for, you know, for each criterion, which is part of the difficulty of this is determining what makes the most sense. So I think when we come back to the work session, we'll have some variety of options, and we can work with you to figure out what makes the most sense.
Yeah, I mean, in this, looking at this graph, it really likes that N2 alignment. You know,
Looking at the graph, it says 7 of your 9 are not technically feasible, or score negative.
Well, and that's
Right.
part of the problem. Really scoring negative does not mean that it's not
That
technically
it's a
feasible.
fatal flaw.
It
Right.
means that it's not scoring as well in technical feasibility as the
Yeah,
other
it's a
two.
comparative
So that's part of the
analysis.
Brian, wouldn't you have been surprised if the commuter rail had scored a lot higher, given the fact we haven't had any real passenger rail per se, all the way through this corridor, north to south, since the 60s?
I
Made any sense?
you know, since I've seen the ridership results, I've been stewing on how to try to explain that. I mean, there's weaknesses in the data that really relate to that. If you think about a travel demand model, and this is true for any region that doesn't have high capacity transit, is you are really basing your mode, what they call mode choice in the model, how a particular trip is, you know, how that person would choose to make their trip in the model, when it's based on data that's had, you know, just the transit system that's in place today. You know, no disrespect to that. I mean, it's just, you know, that system is really predicated on what we call the transit-dependent individual. So we don't really have any empirical data on commuter choice in the model. So the ridership numbers, which are on the slide, do I think they're underreporting ridership? And these are 2035 numbers, just so everybody knows. So they were lower than I was expecting, for sure. And I think they are underreporting. But is the ridership double what we're talking about here? Probably not.
Well, I guess that, and you kind of alluded to it, but the other question is, you're looking at the corridors based upon their distance from the end of the corridor to downtown Oklahoma City. But realistically, is that fair? I mean, I hate to pick on Marion, but Marion commutes from Norman to Edmond for work. Why? Nobody's gonna ask you why, but he does. So, and I think that you're gonna have consistently more growth in commercial and office type entities farther away from the core of Oklahoma City. Not that it's not gonna continue to grow too, but
Right.
to me, to expand the corridor study to actually include the full length north and south, and north over to Midwest City and back, and Midwest City to Norman and back, would seem to give you maybe a little bit better numbers.
Well, and I think that's a perfect segue into what we're talking about here on this slide. There's definitely an opportunity to tweak these alternatives, redesign them if you want, if you will. And there's lots of ways to try to address the service needs in the region. And we're slowly but surely we're learning more about what those needs are. The fact that there's not really the average trip length on transit is much shorter than what we originally anticipated coming out of the model. All right, so that works against commuter rail. Certainly, putting $1 billion into a light rail system that's fully in its own alignment, the ridership's not there for it. So I think we would be ready to eliminate light rail as an alternative, right, Dana?
Mm-hmm.
Just make sure I'm not overstepping my bounds.
No, I do. I think with the cost, with the benefit you get from it, doesn't really weigh out from that standpoint with the light rail. You could get that same type of benefit from a streetcar, which is a little bit less expensive, or some sort of a hybrid of a streetcar and a bus rapid transit, or a streetcar and a commuter rail mixed together, and have a lower cost. And so that's something that's important to think about.
Would any of this change if there was heavy rail going north from downtown Oklahoma City to, say, Fort Kansas on some sort of Amtrak line? Would that change these numbers any if there were those additional concepts?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, that every bit helps. I mean, I think one thing we might consider doing, especially as it relates to north, is examine development further north of Edmond. When you're commuter rail, and as a transit planner, I hate saying this, but commuter rail is the only transit mode that really supports urban sprawl. Because typically, the typical user on commuter rail is generally a higher income individual who's willing to drive up to a quarter of the length of their total trip to rail, park their car, hop on the rail, and read the paper or do stuff online or do whatever they can on their commuter rail trip. And it's really important that you're taking them basically to their front door. See, and that brings up really two other weaknesses in the empirical data on which the model is developed. And that is, we don't feel like our network that we put into the model is adequately addressing the last mile. If you dump them off at Santa Fe, the hub, we're not sure that we're distributing them well enough in order to encourage more ridership on the system. Is that something that we need to think about? I'm trying to think what the other one was. I've been having my senior moments more and more regularly these days. I think there's lots of potential for having what we call hybrid alternatives. Like the data so far in the North Line supports extending the streetcar as it's being laid out now, further north, up to maybe even as far as the Chesapeake campus. Having commuter rail serve the commuter rail line, and then having a series of express buses emanating from the Edmond area to other destinations. And if you built the commuter rail right, with we're talking about real premium service and these cost estimates that you're going to see in a minute. If we downsized it a little bit to sort of meet that longer commute type trip, we could do all three of those for the cost of much less than the cost of the light rail, and have a killer system in the corridor. So there's lots of opportunities to sort of think outside the box, if you will, rather than being married to one of these modes.
Does your model take into, I know it doesn't, psychology and user preferences, which is when you're bringing a whole lot of people from Edmond to downtown and you make them transfer from a commuter rail to a light rail and add a transfer versus a straight through line, you're going to lose you might lose half of your ridership in a transfer, and I bet the model doesn't really evaluate for
It
that,
does
does it?
actually, if there is if you have to, if it's not what they call a one-seat ride from the beginning to your destination, then there is.
There is a transfer penalty in there. That, to me, Marion, I think it's too much of a penalty.
Mm.
And it's pulling a lot of the trips out that actually might be incurred, might actually happen if
But
the
it does take
transfer was
some.
right.
There are some.
Oh,
It
yeah,
does
I mean, it's a
mess it.
huge part. I mean, the data and they're getting better because, since the, early to mid 2000s, when cost became so much more important to the commuter than just travel time, most of the models are really based on travel time. If you can beat a car, you're gonna get the ridership. That's not necessarily true anymore. I mean, with the price of gas going up, there's more financial decision-making that goes into which mode you use. And the model, I know the models are getting better and better at predicting that, but they haven't gotten there yet because we don't have the empirical data that goes into a model that really speaks to that yet, because we haven't had enough years of it being part of the equation in the decision-making process. So, I mean, I'm not enthralled with the ridership. I think they're decent numbers. There's something that we can work with. I think that the numbers would actually be, will actually be a little higher than this. And so, we just need to we have sensitivity analysis upcoming here. We want to play around with our networks a little bit. We want to think about right-sizing the technology to this level of ridership. We want to think about sort of some of the final destinations. We now have a trip table that actually has, we have these districts in the model that actually tell us the total number of trips going from District A to District B. So we can actually look at travel patterns a little bit more closely, and so we can kind of get at that.
Well, N2 and N3, because I'm sorry I got in a little late, like where you've got BRT/LRT/streetcar. So are you indicating that any one of those would have that ridership, or is that a pretty?
Yeah, the model is, I heard a modeler once say that it's agnostic towards mode.
So let me understand this
Use a
then. So
religious
what
term.
that's saying is that the model's saying we could have a commuter rail line from Edmond to downtown, or we could have just a BRT line, and that BRT line is going to have that much more ridership on a bus.
And it's predicated on where it's going.
Right.
The bus is able to hit some more destinations.
And that's the thing too with the model, you have to understand, getting kind of to the mayor's point, I think earlier, was that the model has to use data that's in existence. And so it's using your existing population as well as projected population, but projected population really without a rail alternative or a bus alternative in that particular corridor. So, there's a little bit of, and I see you kind of waving around in there, but really you're using data that's kind of looking at existing information and a trend based on that existing
Well,
information.
that gets back
So-
again to my psychology
Right.
argument. Does your model account for this supposed preference of a lot of the people for a rail vehicle over a bus type vehicle?
And that's-
And if it doesn't, then I think there's something missing
Well,
there.
that's
You
where-
did miss the stool
Right.
argument,
Right,
which we talked about.
okay.
So that is one of the things, is that you have to, the technical
Three legs
data
to
is
the stool.
only gonna tell you so much, right? And then you've gotta take into account what the community and the stakeholders and the leadership in the cities and counties and whatever will actually move forward with and want. And then you've got cost. So there's those three things that really make up your decision on a locally preferred alternative. And I will tell you, more often than not, the technically preferred, if you will, the absolutely perfect, if you will, technical solution is not the one that gets picked.
Rarely.
Because there is a desire from the community or the leadership to have a particular alignment or type of mode. And then there's the cost element that's always a big factor. You need to know how you're gonna pay for it. It's gotta be something you can pay for in the long run with the operations and maintenance ongoing. So again, there is those three stools, and that's one of the things that I'll be talking about in a little bit, is the public and the community and the stakeholders and how we're gonna collect the information for you guys in regards to their preference of a line on a map and a mode, so that you can take those factors into account as you look at the technical data. So like, let's say if you're looking at the commuter rail and N2, like N1, N2, N3, and N7, and you hear from the public that they really like the alignment for N2, but they, 90% of them said they want a rail, then you can start to use that information to make your decision on what moves forward. And maybe you're looking at it and going, well, that's nice, but it starts to get a little expensive. What about if we do that hybrid that, the technical team is kind of telling you might be a good option, is commuter rail for a portion, for it, but then have a streetcar that kind of extends up, and that cost differential and what you get and the benefit that you receive might actually end up working out really well for the public and community stakeholder leaders, for the cost as well as for the benefits from a technical
We've
standpoint.
heard that the developers are willing to invest in commuter rail TODs because they feel like it's permanent. What sort of breakdown is there on bus rapid transit and development belief that this is permanent?
Right, and that was actually a question I asked when I got the analysis the first time, was, okay, hey, I want to understand a little bit better about that, because there is, I agree, from developers, if there's something permanent in the ground that can't move, so a lot of times to them that means rails in the ground, then they're more willing to invest because it's less of a risk. Now there is an idea that with gold standard, if you will, or platinum standard bus rapid transit, which is in fully dedicated right-of-way, that right-of-way is not moving, that theoretically they would come for that as well. So it's
But we
really,
did, we did bump up the rail numbers on
Yep.
the development side, because typically that is higher or more
there is
intense.
a bit of a bias.
Well, are there examples of bus rapid transit TODs out there?
Yeah, the problem is there's not a lot of examples of platinum standard BRT in the United States. So there's really only a few. There's the Health Line in Cleveland. I'm not sure that translates very well to Oklahoma City, and that's a specific situation. You're literally connecting hospitals, and there's a lot of high density.
Yeah, that's not what we're trying to do here.
No, and so
That
it's
would be different from
it's
that.
difficult to look at case studies around the United States and see. But I mean, there are definitely situations where there has been development, TOD type developments around BRT stations. There's just not as much information about that out there as there is for rail.
Well, the problem is when you get to that standard where you attract TOD potentially to a BRT, the cost difference between going to LRT is not, there's not that much more of a jump, and your ridership would be higher.
And just to be devil's advocate, I mean, commuter rail stations typically aren't huge TODs either. I mean, usually you're looking at stations that are in the suburbs of a major metropolitan area that have huge parking lots. And that's not necessarily a place where you want to put, you might put an apartment complex, but you're not going to put major retail or typically office space at one of those stations. Now, the stations in town, you might have a little bit more of an opportunity with commuter rail.
Yeah.
That's commuter rail I would put commuter rail on par with BRT probably in terms of the development side of things. The other issue is that, especially since it's on the freight alignment, it's going to be slow to develop. I mean, that's really, even if it's light rail, it's going to be slow development. That's the problem they're having down in Dallas. Is they built this beautiful system on the freight rails, and they have a bunch of stations that are not getting any ridership at all because the land around it hasn't regentrified yet, and it's going to be a while before it does. So you have to think about that.
Well, I know down in Austin, we have a commuter rail. It's, and it does go basically from what we call a bedroom community or a more suburban.
Northwest suburb,
Yeah, northwest suburb, and then kind of comes into the more densely populated Austin area and then into downtown. And on its first, kind of outing of the commuter rail, the ridership estimates were pretty low, but then they quickly increased. And the reason for that was that they added more service in the midday. People felt like, I can get to work, I can go to lunch, I'm not stuck. So because when they first opened it, they opened it only with morning service and evening service. So then people felt like, oh God, what if I have to get home in the middle of the day? So they added all of that. That increased the ridership. When the ridership increased, they saw more development. And there is development in TODs on that commuter rail line, and it is commuter rail, on existing freight. But the TODs that have developed are the ones that are closer to Austin, so
Core.
downtown core area. And then the more further out, more, northwest, more bedroom communities, if you will, they do not have the TOD development there as of yet. So it can be good in the inner city where redevelopment will probably happen anyways and help accelerate it and form it so that it's focused around a particular station and help kind of placemaking, but it's not necessarily going to just absolutely make it happen wherever.
So what's the relationship between transit ridership and the level of congestion, the cost of actually operating a vehicle? Do those types of variables enter into this modeling at all?
Well, and that we talked a lot about that in governance subcommittee last week, and, we talked sort of about the difference between congestion reduction versus what we call congestion proofing, or building something that's congestion proof. When you look at transit, and this is true of, all of the Southwest systems for the most part, Atlanta, the transit system doesn't have the mode split regionally that you would necessarily expect with that type of investment. I mean, Dallas has spent $5 billion on their system, and if they have 3 to 5% of the total regional trips, I mean, that's 20 counties, they're only in 2.5 counties. It's a very low percentage, so you don't want to predicate the benefits of transit on the regional impact. What you're trying to do is you want to predicate the benefits of transit on what's happening in a specific corridor. And not only in a specific corridor, but in a specific corridor when it's peak. So what transit does is it has a mode split, and the case study that I usually reference in this, and we can get some data on this, is the system in Charlotte, which is a 10-mile light rail system on the south side of downtown. That region is tailor-made for transit. It's got, I think in 2020, it's got 105,000 jobs in this little 2 by 2 mile square there. They call it Uptown. It's a huge financial center. It's a great destination for transit. And it's got 2 parallel roadways. It's got I-77 and Tryon Boulevard, and actually South Boulevard too. And if you looked at the total autos for the day, it's over 200,000 cars on those 3 corridors that are adjacent to it, and about 18,000 people on the train, and I think they predicted 12. So they had to add service as soon as they opened this thing because of so many people. That's 9% of the commute in that corridor. But if you looked at the peak, the percentage went up to 18-20% of the mode split. If you looked at the peak hour of the peak, it went up to like 25%. It was a huge number. And I think the point that we try to make with that data is that when it's time to go add a lane to Tryon Boulevard or to add a lane to I-77, you may be able to either at least delay it and add service on your light rail line. And that's when the investment